everyone. Welcome to the October 7th edition of the TimeformUS Forecast. I'm David Aragona here with my usual co-host Craig Bolkowski, and we are looking ahead to a pretty exciting week in racing. Keeneland opening for their fall meet this weekend, and we're going to take a look at their Saturday late pick 5 sequence. It's an all-stakes pick 5 comprising races 6 through 10, all graded stakes events, including plenty of Breeders' Cup prep races. We're going to go through each one of them. Begins with race 6, the Woodford Turf Sprint featuring heavy favorite Golden Pal, the Thoroughbred Club of America prep for the Breeders' Cup Filly and Mare Sprint. Then we move on to a trio of grade 1 events, the First Lady going a mile on turf for the Fillies and Mares, Breeders' Futurity prep for the Breeders' Cup Juvenile, and we close things out with the grade 1 Coolmore Turf Mile, a prep for the Breeders' Cup Mile on turf. Craig, this is not an easy sequence to handicap, definitely as we get to the last two races, which look wide open.
Agree, those last two races are tough, and looking at the first two, even those could be considered a little bit on the open side. We have a heavy favorite in the first leg, but I think there are maybe some questions with him, and both of the first two have decent field sizes as well. I think the only leg, and I won't say it's easy because it's not like there's an easy single, is the middle leg, but at least it's a smaller field, and I think you can narrow down the contenders pretty easily.
Yeah, that is true, and I guess you can decide for yourself how vulnerable you think this favorite is in the first leg of the sequence. And since we've got a lot to talk about, Craig, let's dive right in to that sixth race on the Saturday card, which begins the pick 5, the grade 2 Woodford going 5.5 furlongs on the turf. And that horse we were referring to that a lot of people probably are going to single is the number 4 Golden Pal, listed at 4-5 on the morning line, and justifiably so, Craig, based on his past accomplishments. He, of course, is the Breeders' Cup Turf Sprint winner from last year. He's won all of his North American starts this year. Really, he's won all of his North American turf starts, period. But he did look somewhat vulnerable last time out at Saratoga, and I think you have to decide if he's a horse that you want to view with some skepticism moving forward.
I spent a lot of time on that decision. When I first started perusing the PPs and looking at the speed figures, I tried to convince myself, yeah, he's fine. He's going to be his old self and just romp in this field. But I'm just a little troubled. I watched that race a few more times and he still didn't look the same. Now, you might want to give him the excuse it was his first race back after he went to Ascot. Maybe he was a little dull. Maybe he wasn't fully cranked up. And he did, after all, win the race and he ran a decent speed figure. But the one thing that's troubling for me is that race was at the beginning of August. He didn't show back up on the work tab till the last day of the month. And then there was another gap of about 3 or 4 weeks where he didn't work out. He's only had 2 works coming in. So I'm going to be one that's on the skeptical side. He's not one of those favorites I'm going to totally toss out. I'll probably get the wrath of some of the people on Twitter because I am going to use him. But it's a race where I'm going to spread. The one thing I'll do with Golden Pal is on the tickets I have him, there it isn't going to be deep tickets where I have many other horses and multiple favorites. I would try to restrict it to him and maybe one other favorite, but mostly I'm going to try to beat him.
Yeah, it's a difficult decision to kick off this sequence because, like you, I thought he looked somewhat vulnerable last time, and I agree. The vibes coming from his camp are a little bit weird. There was talk after the last race that Wesley Ward was going to point him to the Phoenix on the dirt. That obviously didn't pan out. I thought that they were going to train him on the dirt. I guess they might have done it. Yeah, I think they did do it just after that Troy Stakes. There was a gap in his workouts after that. So it feels like there's been some sort of issue with this horse. And also, Wesley Ward has said in the aftermath of the Troy, I didn't see any quotes beforehand, but he said in the aftermath that the plan was to rate last time. And he had told Irad before the race that if the horse didn't break that well, he wanted to see him off the pace, which just seems like such an odd strategy for a horse whose best weapon has always been his gate speed. And when you take that away from him, I think we saw he doesn't have as big of an advantage in these turf sprints as you might expect. So I'm hoping that they revert to the aggressive tactics that they've used with him in the past and that he breaks as sharply from the gate as we had become accustomed to prior to that most recent trip to Royal Ascot. But it's now twice in a row, Craig, that he's broken slowly. Obviously, there was a well-publicized excuse for that, some jockey error in that race over at Royal Ascot, but the fact that he did it again last time makes me a little bit concerned. I still think that if you want to take a shot against him, the Breeders' Cup might be a better place to do it than in this race, where it does feel like if he shows up with even his last effort, he might be able to get the job done. But, Greg, there are a couple of horses in here that I can make cases for as possible upsetters. I'll let you go first because it sounded like you had at least one that you were interested in.
Yeah, one I'll start that's going to be a pretty big price is Bad Beat Brian, drawn to the inside the two hole. He ran a nice speed figure at Kentucky Downs when he got a 118, so just 1 point slower. It was his second start off the claim for Brittany Vandenberg, who's a high percentage barn, wins a lot of races. So I have no knocks on him at all. He's shown pretty far back on the pace projector, but I kind of adjust that myself when it's a horse in a new barn that showed a lot of speed in just the second start. So that's one that I'm interested in. Another one would be Gear Jockey, and maybe I'm being a little silly with that one, but I kind of always get sucked into Gear Jockey. It seems like he finds tough trips, and maybe he will again, but for the most part, he shows up. I think something went wrong in that Jaipur. We haven't seen him in a while. It was also a pretty tough race with Casa Creed, and I just want to give him another chance. A couple others I would use. Oceanic, the six horse in here, ran a really nice speed figure at Colonial Downs. I liked how he did it, tracking off the pace, but while still close up. Able to sit outside horses and really blew them away in the stretch, winning by almost 4 lengths that day. And another horse that's dangerous, particularly if you think that Golden Pal isn't going to explode out of the gate like he usually does, is the seven horse Artemis City Limits, who maybe that 6 furlongs at Kentucky Downs was just a little bit far from him for him, especially when you consider it's more like 6.5. But he's got real turf speed. He is very fast. And on that Keeneland course, if he's able to get away with a clear open lead, he could be very tough in the lane as well.
Well, we're going to give out some ideas in this race because you mentioned four possible alternatives and didn't cover the horse that I think is the biggest threat to Golden Pal. So, I mean, I agree that the horses that you mentioned, they seem like they're in good form right now, or particularly Bad Beat Brian and Oceanic. Artemis City Limits as well. They're all coming off some top last out efforts. I question whether those Kentucky Downs and Colonial races are going to transfer to Keeneland. Each of those tracks, sometimes the performances there can be self-contained, especially with regard to Kentucky Downs. Bad Beat Brian last time watching that race, it sort of felt like Chris Amy and the Connections kind of pulled one over on the field. That was a time when it seemed like speed was really hard to reel in at Kentucky Downs, and they basically just gave them the slip. So I question whether he's going to be able to repeat that effort. And for me, his other races don't put him in the mix, but he'll be a huge price in here. But Craig, the horse that I was most interested in as an alternative is the one all the way on the outside, the number 9, Catamosto. The 3-year-old stepping up against older horses here. He was beaten by a pretty good one last time in his U.S. debut when run down by Big Invasion, but I think that's a race where the race flow is pretty important to review because there was a runoff leader that day, that's right, who is extremely fast in the early going. Catamosto was the only horse that tried to go after him early. He didn't quite get to that foe in the opening quarter mile, but he had a big gap on the rest of the field as he was kind of in no man's land between That's Right and the rest of the runners. He was able to reel that one in, but just couldn't contain the late run of Big Invasion, as most 3-year-old sprinters haven't been able to this year. But I thought it was encouraging that the other speed from that race, That's Right, did come back to win at Parks recently, and I think this horse might be able to take a step forward second time in this country. He had previously been with Joseph O'Brien. Now he's with Mark Casse. He had some solid European form prior to this, had faced some good horses over there. So I think he's a pretty intriguing alternative getting Flavien Prat aboard, and he could get dismissed at a decent price in this race.
He's the one other horse I had in my notes, and I have a question mark because I'm just not sure. I don't like that he's a 3-year-old trying older. That's right. We did see him come back to win the Turf Monster, a race we handicapped on the forecast a couple weeks ago. So, and he is a fast one, no doubt about it. I do hate the chase position. So, luckily, this is one we're going to be able to see the odds. If he's around that morning line of 10 to 1 or so, I would use him. If he gets bet down from that, I'd be a little more skeptical.
Yeah, and I'm taking a pretty similar approach to you, Craig. I probably, if I was making an ABC kind of ticket, I would lean on Golden Pal a little bit because I do think he is very much the most likely winner of this race. I'd want to have probably Catamosto as my B, and maybe I could use horses like Gear Jockey, who I agree with the points you made, and Artemis City Limits as C's. I think those are the three with a real chance to upset, but it's a difficult race to begin with because you do have to decide how much confidence you want to place in a heavy favorite. There are places to make money later in the sequence, though, even if this first race is too difficult for you to figure out. Let's move on to race 7. It is the Grade 2 Thoroughbred Club of America, 6 furlongs on the dirt for the fillies and mares, and this one is truly wide open because you've got a lot of fillies who aren't quite at the top of the division, but they've all kind of been hovering around in that, second or third tier, and there's a lot of pace in this race, Craig. I think looking at the TimeformUS pace projector could be really instructive here because it does seem like this is going to set up for somebody to come from off it.
This is a tough race. It feels like this is a race where somebody's going to have to make a breakout. And I guess they almost have to because none of them really have top level wins on their resume yet. Not at the biggest levels where the winner of this race, I would suspect, would show up back at Keeneland for the Breeders' Cup. And just a side note as well, if you decide that that first race is just too tough in the sequence, there is an all stakes pick 4 that begins in this race as well. Um, this one was tough for me. I think for handicapping, the first horse I started with was Slammed, the 7 horse, just because she comes in with the best last race speed figures for Todd Fincher. He's shown that he can ship his horses around and win. He's kind of branching out from his New Mexico base. We just saw his horse win last week at Churchill when the ACAC. So I think she's tough. I would be a little more against her had she drawn inside, but she's not a horse who has to have the lead. She is one who's able to track. So even though she is, I think she's the morning line favorite at 3 to 1. 3 to 1. I think she's pretty dangerous, and I don't want to dismiss her at all. She's one that I'm going to use. I'm going a little bit different direction for my top pick, though, and that's a horse a little to the inside of her in the 4 horse Caribbean Caper. She was a horse who began her career just reeling off win after win. I think it was 5 of them. Um, most by pretty easily. She does it tracking the pace, which she's going to need to do here. But I actually liked her return race. She lost at 8 to 5 that day, but it was a race where she was caught wide. The pace was supersonic fast, especially the opening quarter. She made a move on the turn, got up near the lead before getting tired, which isn't a surprise off like 11 months off. And it just seems like me, she is primed for a good effort. Trainer Al Stahl always seems to have his horses fit and ready to go at Keeneland. So she's one I like quite a bit in here.
Yeah, we agree that she's a major player in this race. I don't know if I'd call her my top pick, but she's right around there for me as well, Craig. My one problem with Caribbean Caper is that her last race, she did have a big excuse. The pace was way too fast and it completely fell apart if you watch that race. I can't say that I love her form prior to that. She's never really run that breakout speed figure that you're looking for somebody to produce in this race. Her top of a 110 is not quite going to get it done here. I suppose she was a 3-year-old back then, but I also wonder what kind of price she's going to be in this race. She looks like a closer who could get the right kind of pace set up. She's taken a lot of money in her prior races. Maybe some people will be turned off by that seemingly poor return that's not as bad as it looks. But I think she's very dangerous in here, but it is the kind of race where I do want to look for some prices. Craig, that a horse that you might want to default to when you see this pace projector could be the number 5 Sconsin because she does run well from off the pace. She comes in with one of the better resumes. She's won almost $1 million in her career. I just feel like she's not the Sconsin that we used to know. She's kind of been going in the wrong direction from a speed figure standpoint recently. Yes, she's faced some pretty poor pace situations at Churchill Downs, but she's been successful in those situations in the past, and I just feel like she might not be good enough to win this race at this stage of her career.
I agree. I suspect she's tailed off. And even though the pace scenario didn't look great last time, she was actually kind of a part of it. And what's telling to me is she kind of had Bell's the one's number for a little bit. She was finishing ahead of her, and that one's turned the table. She didn't show up. I mean, the race was only 3 weeks ago, and I agree. She just hasn't looked like the same Sconson at 5 years old. Her return race was pretty good when she took the grade three winning colors, but it just hasn't been very good since. So she's one I'm not using in here at all.
Yeah, another horse that I want no part of in this race is the number 9 Happy Soul, who improved on turf last time. I guess Wesley Ward's putting her back on the dirt because he has too many turf sprinters and he doesn't know what to do with them. To me, she's not a contender in this race, and she's actually a relatively short 6-1 on the morning line, so she does nothing for me. Let me talk about some horses that I am interested in. The number 1, Lil Tootsie, I think at a big price could get in the mix. I like turnbacks like this in general. It might seem like she improved going longer, but I just think that she's been improving in the overall sense for a little while. I know she was beaten by Sconson earlier in the year, but I think they've kind of gone different ways since then from a form standpoint. She ran a competitive speed figure 2 back in the Group E Doll. I thought the 2 turns last time was just too far for her. I like the turn back to 6 furlongs, and she's going to get some pace to close into, so I think she's dangerous, Craig. I wouldn't even discount a horse like the number 6 Liberty MD, who I know looks like she's too slow coming in, but she's another that has won 2 of her last 3 starts. It looks like she's improving. Could excuse her race 2 back when Goodnight Olive just kind of, dominated that race towards the front end, wasn't that fast a pace, and she's a horse that would really benefit if this race completely falls apart because she's got a strong late kick on her. So I'm looking for horses that are going to be making the last move in this race because I think there's so much speed, something has to give on the front end.
I think you nailed the 2 best closers if you don't like Sconson in here. I would prefer Little Tootsie a little bit more. If this race were 7 furlongs, she'd be my top pick. The 6 is a little troubling. I think maybe she might get lost, and I'd use her more as a vertical threat. But she'll be on my tickets because if things do get really hot and the pace collapses, I think she is definitely one that's going to come running. And I agree with you with Liberty MD. She seems to be going in the right direction, especially if you put a line through that Goodnight Olive race. And when races fall apart, these are the kind of horses that win. She doesn't necessarily have to improve her speed figure. Maybe if she did just up to the 110 range, that could be good enough in a field like this.
And we didn't even mention a horse that I think could vie for favoritism in this race. That's the number 2, Palm Cottage. She's just drawn in a really difficult position, Craig, because she's inside all of the other speed. She's done her best running up from the front end. It feels like Flavian Pratt is going to be committed to go from the inside. She is in great form. She beat a good horse in Boston Post Road last time at Saratoga, but Flavian Pratt's going to have to get a little creative trying to work out the right trip on her.
Right, and she's one who has won her last 2. She is in good form, but she's done it setting relatively slow paces and without a whole lot of pressure. And it's hard for me to envision her getting that trip here. So I'm going to be against her.
Let's move on to the middle leg of this all stakes pick 5 sequence. Beginning the grade 1 action on this card, it is the First Lady going a mile on the turf for the fillies and mares. And like Craig was saying at the start, this is the one smallish field in this sequence with just 6 runners signed on. And it feels like the quality is really concentrated right in the middle with those 3 Chad Brown runners who figure to take the bulk of attention here. Craig, I have no argument that Regal Glory is much the horse to beat. She's listed at 6-5 on the morning line, and I think that's about right. She just loves this 1 mile distance, almost won this race last year, feels like she's stepped forward since returning as a 6-year-old, and I can easily make an excuse for her last time when she got beaten by a very good Casa Creed and arguably had the tougher trip than that one.
Yeah, I have no knocks on Regal Glory at all. I'll certainly be using her. I wanted to try to make a case for some of the other runners that not trained by Chad Brown, but I just couldn't get there. A couple of them are long shots. Princess Grace, I think she's fine. I just think this is a level above her. I don't think that Beverly D at Churchill was a true grade 1, and she just feels like more a grade 3, maybe grade 2 horse on her best day. So I couldn't get to that one. Of the other Chad Browns, though, I don't want to totally dismiss an Italian. I really liked her racing the Diana, as did most people, where she just went out and speed blitzed the field, was able to hold on. I was a little concerned that we haven't seen her since the middle of July, but when you look at her work tab, it seems like this was the plan all along because she's basically been working steadily ever since that race. I think she's maybe missed one workout since that race, and who knows if it was even a miss. But so she's been working steadily. So I want to use her as well, particularly when I just don't think there's a lot of other speed in this field. The other speed would probably be the other Chad Brown technical analysis, but they've been in the same race before, including that Diana, and it seemed like she ceded the lead to an Italian, and I suspect that may happen again. So if I had to make a top pick, it would probably be an Italian, but I will use her in Regal Glory in equal strength and probably fade the other Chad Brown technical analysis.
Yeah, I'm very interested to see what we get from an Italian here. I agree. She was so impressive last time, setting that extremely fast pace and just continuing on. That Diana was a race where it seemed like nobody really closed. It was sort of a merry-go-round affair, but sometimes when races feature fast paces like that, you can just run the closers off their feet and make them go too fast early by trying to stay in attendance to that pace. And I think it sapped the late kicks of a horse like Bleecker Street and Rougier, who finished farther back. So if an Italian uses those same tactics here, she could be dangerous. I guess maybe you might say the Keeneland turf course in the fall is going to play a little differently than that Saratoga turf course when it hadn't gotten a lot of rain in the middle of summer, so maybe it's not going to carry her as much, but she had run better than it appears in her two prior races when setting or chasing fast paces in the Just a Game, getting the wrong trip in the Distaff Turf Mile. So like we were saying prior to the Diana, she was a better horse than she looked coming into that race. I do feel like, okay, I got the money last time and I liked her in that race at 8-1. Do I really need to take her at 5-2 or 3-1, this First Lady? I'm not going to be too bullish on her chances here, but I do think that she's the biggest threat to Regal Glory. I probably would regard Regal Glory as a slightly more likely winner, but I agree with you, Craig. In Italian is very much the other one that I want to use in this race because, like you said, technical analysis, I'm just not sure what's the right trip for her. She didn't go after, or maybe couldn't go after in Italian in the early stages of that Diana. I was hoping she'd be more impressive last time winning that Boston Spa. She was a little bit life and death to do so. Maybe the mile and a 16th was a little far for her, but, turning back to a mile, it's not that big of a difference. I just feel like she hasn't quite taken the step forward that I would have wanted to see from her this year. So I did, like you, prefer the other two Chad Brown runners. Let's move on to the final two races of this sequence where things get particularly difficult, beginning with a wide open edition of the Grade 1 Breeders' Futurity, race 9 at Keeneland on Saturday. This one going a mile and a 16th on the dirt course for the 2-year-olds. We've got an oversubscribed field here, 14 runners in the main body, 2 also eligible entrants. Craig, trips and post position seem like they're going to be pretty important in this race as you have these inexperienced 2-year-olds jockeying for position heading into that clubhouse turn.
It's this one's quite the handicapping puzzle. If you're able to narrow this one down very far, good on you because it was tough for me. I think there's several contenders. I'll start with just a couple horses before I hand it back to you because I'm sure we're going to talk about several in here. I guess the first one you have to start with is the morning line favorite Forte, and how strong do you think he is? Personally, I don't think he's all that strong. He looked good winning the Hopeful. It was a sloppy track. He beat Gulfport that day, who Gulfport's a good horse, but he's got an inflated reputation. I think he's lost 3 in a row now as the favorite, including that day in the Hopeful. So I think Forte can win. I don't love him in this spot. I'm sure he's going to be over bet. The horse that I'm going to make my top pick is a horse that really impressed me last time at Churchill winning an allowance race. He draws inside, and that's Frosted Departure for Ken McPeak. I just loved everything I saw about that race. It looked great visually. He ran the fastest last race speed figure in the field with a 110. He's a horse who I don't think the 2 turns is going to prove to be any problem whatsoever. So I'm not sure if we're going to get that 10-1 morning line. Maybe we will. There's some other high profile barns, including Brad Cox has a couple in here that seem to have impressive resumes. But for me, I'm going to start my ticket with Frosted Departure.
Oh, I think you're going to get every bit of that 10-1 and probably more on Frosted Departure. There are just too many horses in this race that have to take money with sexier looking running lines, a maiden win that looked impressive, or like Forte coming off a Grade 1 victory that I think are going to get bet a lot harder. I agree. I was impressed by Frosted Departure's last race. I'm somewhat bothered by his race prior to that when he faced much better horses and didn't show up. Both of his wins have come against inferior competition, but I do feel like he could be in that 15 to 20 to 1 range. So I don't want to I don't want to be too hard on him. He's a horse that I think could inject some value into the sequence if you like him. We've got a couple of Brad Cox trainees in here that are coming off debut victories that I think need to be discussed, particularly the number 2 Loggins, who felt like he debuted just a second ago. I feel like we were just talking about this race on the Pacecast, but he's wheeling back on pretty short rest, I think just 3 weeks, Craig. Maybe that's a little bit of a concern that it seems like they have to rush him into this race a little bit, but boy, did he look good on debut. He drew off impressively and galloped out like he's going to love every bit of the added distance.
Yeah, unfortunately, he's wheeling back so quick, even though he broke his maiden in a big field. I think it was 12 horses that day. He ran a 108 speed figure, but not a single horse has run back from it yet. He'll be the first one, unless there's one entered today that I missed. So I wonder about that speed figure, but the way he did it doesn't seem like it should be an issue. The 3 weeks, that's a little bit of a concern for me. That's not really Brad Cox's MO. He's also a guy that usually improves horses second time out. So it's kind of a, you know, two sides of the coin here. It just depends on which one you want to lean on. I'm gonna have to use Loggins. He was just too good not to. But he's not a horse I would want to lean on because I just think this is a really deep, tough field. As for the other Brad Cox, Instant Coffee, it's kind of the same though. He did it a little bit differently. He didn't really show that speed early. You kind of had to be worked on. He was overlooked at the betting windows that day. So maybe he surprised some, but I would have to consider him the other Brad Cox in here. I don't think he's quite got the talent that Loggins does.
Yeah, I would agree. Loggins showed brilliance first time out. He traveled strongly early in the race, took over without much encouragement, and once he was set down, he just sailed clear in the stretch. And it does feel like he has a lot of talent. I think it's just a question of how much speed he's got to deal with on the front end, because it does feel like from this inside post, they could have to be somewhat aggressive with him once again, and just whether he can repeat or move forward off that effort on such short rest. And I actually would prefer the 5 Instant Coffee at what I think will be a better price. He ran in one of 3 divisions of a 7 furlong maiden race on that Saturday card towards the end of the Saratoga meet, and he raced in the fastest of the 3 divisions and won it. Like you said, didn't take a lot of money that day, but I really liked the way he ran. He took some dirt racing in behind horses, came through along the inside, and was just really game to get the job done that day, and seemed like a horse, at least to me, that's not going to mind some added ground. And in this race, I think you want a horse that's shown some ability to race through traffic, come from off the pace, because a horse is going to have to do that in here. I mean, it's going to be difficult to work out a trip in this field where it just seems like there's so much speed signed on, so many runners in the starting gate. So I like the attributes that Instant Coffee showed first time out. As for the Todd Pletcher trainees, Craig, I agree that Forte is coming out of a hopeful that you can debate the quality of a little bit. It was encouraging to see the 3rd place finisher Blazing Sevens come back to win the Champagne last week. I still think, even though he took a big speed figure step forward, there's some question as to how strong that Champagne was compared to a race like this. Forte, I do think, has plenty of talent, and I would be more willing to judge him off his last race than I would the Sanford prior to that, because he didn't have the best of trips that day. I'll be interested to see if he's one that improves with added distance. I'm not sure if I really agree that he's going to be a Derby type of horse just based on the way that he runs in pedigree. The other Pletcher runner in here I think also needs to be discussed, the number 10 Lost Ark. He's faced weaker company in his 2 races so far, particularly last time when they took the path of least resistance, running him in that Monmouth Stakes race, the Sapling. But at least he showed that he could handle the 2 turns. He's certainly bred to go farther. He's the half-brother to Nest, as well as Idol, the Santa Anita handicap winner. So there's pedigree for this one to stretch out, and he's been pretty impressive in both career starts, Craig. I think this is just a big step up in class.
It is. The post isn't great, but with his running style, maybe it won't matter if he duplicates what we saw in that Sapling at Monmouth. Um, yeah, the post is the one knock because I think the distance is going to be fine. I think the pace is going to be a good setup for him. He gets Fabian Prat, so he's going to be on my tickets for sure. Obviously, I'm spreading. There was one more horse that I think I wanted to talk about, and that's Bob Baffert's Newgate, who's drawn out in the 8 hole. But I don't want to totally dismiss this one because he won his debut easily, as you would expect from a horse that was 2 to 5 for Bob Baffert. And I don't want to dismiss him off his loss in the Delmore Futurity because Cave Rock is a horse who has just been running huge speed figures for a 2 year old early in his career. So I found it interesting that Bob Baffert ships to Keeneland. It's one of those. I assume he just has so many 2 year olds. He can't run them all in California. Obviously, he can't run in New York. So maybe it's just this is his C string. But I don't want to totally leave Newgate out at what's going to be a huge price.
Yeah, I kind of don't think he can be anywhere near 20 to 1 in this race. I mean, they do have a new morning line maker at Keeneland, Nick Tamro, who's been on this podcast before, and I think Nick does a great job. And I expect the morning lines to be pretty accurate at this Keeneland meet. I feel like a Bob Baffert runner can't possibly be that high in a race like this, but he's not going to be among the favorites for sure. I mean, there are other horses that just seem like they have more upside and have to take more money in this race. And I guess the preferred Bob Baffert runner would have been Carmel Road, who's stuck on the also eligible list. I don't even know if they're going to ship here, given the way that he drew in this race. I suppose they'll have to go with Newgate. We'll see what they decide to do with those two. But I didn't love either one in here. Newgate, I have some questions about him being a horse that handles at a distance. There is some pedigree to maybe get a mile on the dam side. He doesn't necessarily strike me as that type, so I kind of wanted to go against both of the Baffert runners in here if they somehow do both run and look towards others. If I had to point to one long shot that I found a little bit interesting, Craig, it would be the number 11, Red Route 1, who would be making his dirt debut in this race, and this certainly is a tough spot to be trying a new surface. But he feels to me like a horse that Steve Asmussen just started out on the turf because he's a horse that wants to go longer. There is a little bit of turf pedigree, one sibling, won a minor stakes on the turf, but it's a pedigree that can really go either way. The Dam is actually a full sister to Untappable, that excellent dirt horse that won the Kentucky Oaks, the Breeders' Cup Distaff, it was a champion. This one's by Gunrunner. I feel like this horse is going to have no problem transitioning to the dirt, and it really feels like he's the kind of horse that is going to blossom once stamina becomes more of an emphasis in these races. He can close from off the pace. I like the way he broke his maiden at Kentucky Downs last time. Obviously has to take a big step forward in here, but he just seems like one that could have some upside getting on the dirt. And of the long shots that I'd consider, he'd be the one that really caught my fancy. But I'm not going to be way against the favorites in here, Craig. I just think there's too much talent that's evident among horses like Loggins, Instant Coffee, and Forte. I'm not way against any of them.
Yeah, I can understand that point of view. I'm going to spread a little bit more than you, and I'll be honest, I won't be surprised. I can't remember if we covered every horse, but there's probably 7 or 8 horses in here that wouldn't shock me if they won. So pretty decent one. Maybe I'm being a little hopeful that one of the favorites won't win because, as you said, I don't have any real big knocks on any of them. It's just their price. I think this is a fascinating race.
No, I mean, if the post positions had been differently, I would have talked up Powerful a little bit, but I mean, it's hard to like a horse like that who needs to be forward, who's drawn in post position 14. I think he's going to appreciate the added distance, and I like the attributes he's displayed, but geez, that's a tough post for him.
Yeah, post is tough at this mile and a 16th distance at Keeneland, and that definitely had an effect on the way I leaned as well.
Well, let's move on to the final leg of this pick 5 sequence. It is race 10, the grade 1 Coolmore Turf Mile, going a mile on the turf course for the older males. This one is the prep for the Breeders' Cup Mile, and Craig, we could see a few of these horses back in the Breeders' Cup Mile because it certainly feels like this is the strongest U.S. prep for that race. We've got a lot of quality in here. Pretty wide open affair, though, and feels like one of these U.S. horses is going to really have to step forward to assert themselves because it's a pretty hard field to kind of sift through and throw too many horses out. I'm not even sure where is the best place to start. I guess the number 7 Santine is a horse that we could begin with. He's listed as the morning line favorite, and I have a big question with him. Is he just some Churchill Downs wonder horse, or is he going to transfer that form to Keeneland? Because the form between Churchill and the rest of the tracks he's run over is a little bit dichotomous.
I know he's a horse we both liked a lot last year. He kind of debuted late in his 3 year old season, exploded on the scene, almost got a grade 1 in the Hollywood Derby. I'm against him in this spot. I just don't believe those Churchill races. That is not a course that resembles any other turf course we're going to see anywhere else. And it just seems a little bit fishy to me that he didn't run well at all at Belmont. He didn't run particularly well at the fairgrounds, even though he ran second. I mean, two Emmys is okay, but two Emmys is not really a grade one horse, in my opinion. And I just think those Churchill races are phony, and as the morning line favorite, I'm chucking them.
Yeah, I think I'm going to lean in that same direction, especially if he takes that kind of money in this race. I'd rather go for some others in here. A horse that I'm not against, who does own a couple grade one victories this year, is the number 9, Casa Creed. And I know his connections have kind of been going back and forth over the past couple of years, whether he's more of a sprinter or more of a miler. I think he's versatile enough to handle both and run equally well going 6 furlongs as he does a mile, Craig. And it just seems like he's in fantastic form right now since coming back from an overseas trip earlier in the year. And there's supposed to be a little pace in this race, and he's a horse that does need some help up front. I think he's going to get it. And to me, he's just super logical in this race.
I knew you'd pick the neighborhood. No, I'm just kidding. I couldn't resist. No, I have no issues with Casa Creed as well. I know we talked about him last time. We had both said, I think you suggested, and I agreed. A mile is no problem for him. He's just versatile enough that he's able to turn back and run well in sprints. But I actually think a mile's his best distance. He's likely to get more pace. He gets a little more time to make his run. So I've got no problems with Casa Creed whatsoever. I think he's going to get a nice setup in here. We have plenty of speed drawn in. Smooth like Straight's a horse who we know is going to go to the front, go pretty quick. Some like it Hot Brown. I would assume they're going to go. I mean, it's the only real way he ever runs well is to go. So just those two alone are pretty quick. And it seems like he's a logical horse in here. A couple more I think that we really need to talk about. We'll start with Smooth Like Straight. What do you do with him, David? Because he's a horse who always runs fast and doesn't win very often, except in California.
I mean, I guess you can have some confidence he's going to be in the trifecta because it seems like he always is. I mean, he's right there at the ends of every one of these races, but he just does not get the job done. And I mean, at a certain point, you kind of do have to say maybe it's a little bit of a horse's character trait that he just doesn't fight for it. But I mean, he's got plenty of ability from a TimeformUS speed figure sense. He's coming in arguably as the horse to beat because, I mean, he's got a set of numbers that make him look pretty formidable. It's just hard to be too confident with him in a pick 5 wager because you need him to actually win the race. So he's one that I probably would downgrade a little bit. Craig, a horse that I think is pretty dangerous in here is the number 3 Order of Australia, who is the one foreign shipper that drew into the main body of the field. And I mean, it feels like a long time ago, but it was only 2 years ago that he was winning a Breeders' Cup Mile at Keeneland at a gigantic price, and he's back to the scene of that, premier victory for him. Obviously didn't run well in this race last year, but it's kind of interesting. He was coming into that race last year as the 6-5 favorite with seemingly excellent European form, unlike when he won the Breeders' Cup Mile 2 years ago, where he was coming in with pretty lackluster European form. Now he's coming in with some middling form. I mean, he's run okay, but not really been competitive in some Group 1 races. So maybe he's going to get back to one of his better U.S. performances.
He's going to be my top pick in here, believe it or not. I just have this feeling that the European horses are so much better than our horses this year. It just seems that way watching. I watch a lot of the races, particularly all the group races overseas. And it's hard for me to be overly impressed with what we've seen. I mean, the horses are okay, but this is not Tepin or some of the really good lures, some of the really good milers we've seen. In Order of Australia, he's been okay this year. His one race that looks bad was to Baaid. Modern Games was second. But his form is decent, and it just feels like with a good post, a good pace setup, I think he's going to run well in here. I guess they're going to try the Breeders' Cup again, but I think he's going to get a nice trip and has a real shot.
I agree. I definitely want to use him. I don't know if I'd call him my top pick, but he's a horse that I think will be a fair price this year, unlike last year, and he's a horse that I definitely do want to have in the mix. One more horse I want to mention, Craig, that I think is a little interesting in this race that I'm also going to be using prominently would be the number 8, Annapolis. I know he looks a little slower than some others on paper, but He feels like the one horse in this field that has real upside. I don't think that a mile and 3/16 was the right distance for him to back. It just felt like he was exposed a little bit from a stamina standpoint that day. Wasn't beating anything last time, but this horse has been pretty impressive in some of his turf races, albeit against weaker company. But he feels like he could be a blossoming U.S. turf miler. So at what could be a fair price for these connections, Irad Ortiz and Todd Pletcher, he's one that I definitely want to use.
I'm personally avoiding the 3-year-olds. That includes him in Classic Causeway. I see why you would want to go there. I just think they're a little bit slow. So in a ticket that's probably going to cost me a bit of money, I'm going to take my chances and think he is a blossoming miler, but it'll be more next year than this year. The one other horse I wanted to ask you about, I'm not going to use him personally. I know we both used him in the Woodbine Mile as Ivar. Um, He's looked good. I just think he's a cut below this grade one level. I don't think that Woodbine Mile outside of modern games was the strongest field. The other shipper, Finest Sound, who was kind of a long shot in that race, ran third. So I'm not using Ivar, but I can see where people might be tempted to. He's won this race before here at Keeneland.
He could be a backup for me. I mean, if I was making ordinal picks, he'd maybe be like the fourth pick. I think that he has plenty of back form that makes him very competitive here. He's run very well in 2 consecutive Breeders' Cup miles. I think he was fourth 2 years ago and he was third last year. So, I mean, the form is there for him to be competitive in a race like this. I agree. I was hoping for a little more last time, but maybe nobody was beating modern games that day. And third off the layoff, I'm not going to be surprised when he takes another step forward for a very sharp barn. So he's one that I could use as a backup, but he's not one of my A horses.
And the one other horse I think we better mention, or we might face some wrath, is Chad Brown has an entrant here in Emirati, and he actually ran a really big speed figure last time at Saratoga when he won the Bernard Baruch. He did so setting the pace. I think that's way out of the question in this spot, but he's also won from off the pace. He beat City Man that day, who is a good solid horse, has come back to win since. He's certainly not a grade one type horse, I don't think. But what do you do with Emirati?
Well, Chad Brown actually has two horses in this race. He's got
Ah,
Emirati and he's got Mason, and we didn't talk about either one. I don't like either one that much. I thought Emirati got loose on a turf course that kind of helped him, set the pace and go on to victory last time. So he's definitely not for me. And Mason, I thought he was, he just barely lost over this course early in the year, but I thought that Maker's Mark was a weaker race than this one overall, and he hasn't stepped forward since then. So no Chad Brown runners for me in this Coolmar Turf Mile.
yeah, I tend to agree. Especially about Emirati. I thought that was, I can't remember if that was one of the days where the rails were down, but it seemed like Speed was doing very well that day. But I didn't want to slip out without mentioning them.
Well, we've mentioned a lot of horses as we went through this sequence, Craig, so let's do just a little bit of a recap. This is not one where I think we could narrow it down too far because it does feel like a few of these races just necessitate some spreading. But let's just go through and kind of highlight some horses that we do want to use prominently on our tickets.
Okay, the Woodford I'm going to start. I'm going to play two tickets. One is going to use Just Golden Pal, and it's going to be a pretty thin ticket. And the other one, I'm going to spread a bit more. I would use horses like Bad Beat Brian, Oceanic, Artemis City Limits, the horse you mentioned, Catamosto. Feels like that was about. Oh, and Gear Jockey was the other one that I mentioned. The TCA Oaks, I'm going to lean pretty heavily on two horses in here. That would be Caribbean Caper and Slammed. But I would use some of those closers you mentioned, Liberty MD and Little Tootsie as well. In the First Lady, I'm going to lean heavily on Regal Glory and in Italian. That's it for me. Not going to try to go any deeper. The Breeder's Futurity, going to spread a little bit more in here. For A's, I would use Frosted Departure and Loggins, but I would also use that other Brad Cox Instant Coffee. I would use Newgate, and I would have to look at my tickets. I would probably try to get Forte in there. I do think he's pretty good and don't want to leave him out totally. Uh, in the last race, as I said, I'm going to use Order of Australia as an A horse. A couple others, I'm not going to use Ivar at all. Casa Creed is one that I would use. I think he's got a chance. And just depending how my ticket plays out, I would maybe throw Smooth Like Straight in there as well.
As for me, I'm probably a little bit more confident, or at least I'm going to use Golden Pal a little more strongly than Craig in that first leg. I have some questions, but I feel like this might be a field he can beat. And my main backup would be the number 9 Catamosto. I probably would view him as more of like a win bet kind of horse as opposed to one that I really want to use strongly in the first leg of a pick 5 sequence. But I think he's the main threat. So I'm going to try not to go too deep in that Woodford. Moving on to the TCA, the horses that interest me most would be the number 1 Lil Tootsie, the number 4 Caribbean Caper, the number 6 Liberty MD, maybe to a slightly lesser extent, but due to her price, she's one that I'll probably upgrade a little bit. I'm not way against horses like Slammed and Palm Cottage. I think they've got the talent to win this race. I'm just not sure, given their prices, if I want to rely on them with the way this pace is going to shape up. Race 8, the First Lady, Craig and I are in agreement. It's Regal Glory and an Italian. I prefer Regal Glory a little bit from a win percentage standpoint, but I think an Italian will once again be a better price, so I'll use both of them. In the Breeders' Futurity, I'm not really against either one of the Brad Cox trainees. I probably prefer the value on Instant Coffee a little bit more as opposed to Loggins, but they're both horses I want to use. Forte and Lost Ark, the Todd Pletcher duo, are a little difficult for me to separate. I probably do prefer Forte a little bit. We'll see how they bet them respectively. I think they both could take money, and my bomb to use in the Breeders' Futurity would be the number 11, Red Route 1, who I do think is going to ultimately be okay as a dirt router. And then we will close things out with the Coolmore Turf Mile. I like the number 9, Casa Creed, probably as my top pick, but I also would use the number 3, Order of Australia, and the number 8, Annapolis. They're the 3 that would be my main uses in that race. As backups, I could throw in horses like Ivar, even Smooth Like Straight, who probably is going to win one of these races at some point, but he's a little tough to be too confident about on the win end. Well, Craig, we gave out a lot of ideas in this sequence, and it does feel like one that will pay pretty well. Even if Golden Pal wins that first leg, it feels like there could be some chaos later on. So definitely one we're going to have to get a little bit creative to create a winning ticket.
Right. Keeneland, they only run for a few weeks. I think it's 3 weeks here in the fall. I forget exactly, but they always offer challenging races. They don't seem to struggle too much with the field size thing that we see plaguing some other tracks currently. And as the site of the Breeders' Cup, I'm sure many horses that have Breeders' Cup aspirations want to run here and get a race over the track. So it's going to be a really fun weekend of racing.
Well, that is it for our forecast this week. Craig, I know that you're going to be off next week, so I'll try to put out a couple of podcasts. I'll see if I can get a couple guests lined up. I'm still looking to do that, but we'll definitely try to do the forecast. I'll see if I can quickly get a guest lined up for the Pacecast. But Craig, you'll be back the Tuesday after next. Is that correct?
It is. It's my 30th anniversary next week, so I'm taking some time off. And you people who are on Twitter, make sure to send condolences to my wife Elsie, who's on there for putting up with me all this time.
Well, I wish a happy anniversary to both you and Elsie, and hope you guys enjoy your week off. Everybody, thanks for listening to the TimeformUS Forecast this week. Remember, you can always catch these podcasts on DRF.com, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. Wherever you get your podcast, just make sure to subscribe to the Daily Racing Form channel. Again, thanks for tuning in, and make sure to catch that episode of the TimeformUS Pacecast next Tuesday.